Chapter 18 of the Book of Enoch describes the earth being held in place by 4 specific structures, positioned at 4 specific points, doing a specific job, language that has almost nothing in common with the way Genesis describes the world being made. The Book of Enoch was removed from the Bible by the Council of Laodicea in 364 CE. For 17 centuries, the Church called it forbidden. When 11 copies surfaced among the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1947, scholars got their first real chance in over a millennium to read exactly what Enoch said the earth actually was, and it is not the earth Sunday school ever described. If forbidden biblical cosmology is the kind of thing you can't stop pulling on once you start, hit subscribe now. Every week we go back into the manuscripts and read past what got smoothed over. And if you already sense where this is going, drop your theory in the comments before we get there. Enoch chapter 18 doesn't describe creation as an event. It describes the earth as it exists now, mid-operation, held together by an ongoing structure. Enoch is shown what the text calls the 4 winds that bear the earth and the firmament of heaven. Not weather, not metaphor for the cardinal directions, but 4 distinct forces, each stationed at a fixed point, each doing continuous structural work. Dr. Michael Knib, whose 1978 Oxford translation remains the scholarly standard, notes that the passage uses load-bearing language, the same vocabulary the text elsewhere uses for pillars and foundations, not for atmospheric phenomena. The earth, in this account, is not simply floating. It is being held. Chapters 24 and 25 describe 7 mountains at the edge of Enoch's journey, arranged in a pattern the text is oddly insistent about. 1 at the center, 6 surrounding it, each made of a different named stone. This is not a mountain range a geographer would recognize. Fragment material from Qumran, identified as 4Q206, preserves related terminology from this section in Aramaic, dated to roughly 100 BCE, older than every book of the New Testament. Dr. George Nicholsberg's 2001 commentary for Fortress Press, still the field's definitive reference, describes this passage as architectural rather than topographical, meaning the mountains function less like a landscape and more like components, something built, not something that eroded into place. At the center of those 7 mountains, Enoch is shown one he calls the Throne Mountain, and beside it, a tree with a fragrance unlike anything on the earth's surface. Chapter 26 then does something almost no translation gives its full weight. It names a specific location as the center of the earth, the navel, in the direct rendering, and identifies it with the blessed Holy Land. Not a poetic center, a structural one, positioned in relation to the 7 mountains, the same way the mountains are positioned in relation to each other. Everything in this section of Enoch is described relationally. This point exists because of its distance and direction from that one. It reads less like scripture and more like a survey. The astronomical book, chapters 33 through 36, extends this same structural logic outward to the edges of the earth itself. Enoch is carried to what the text calls the ends of the earth and shown gates, not metaphorical doorways, but structural openings through which winds, stars, and light are said to pass in and out on a fixed schedule. 12 gates for the sun's yearly path were catalogued in earlier chapters. Here, additional gates are described specifically for the wind and for the stars, each with its own function, each maintained rather than simply existing. An earth with edges, gates, and a maintained structure at those edges is not the earth described in Genesis 1. It is something closer to a sealed, engineered system. Before we go further, if a pattern like this, one structural detail after another, is exactly what keeps you rewatching a passage instead of skimming past it, subscribe and like this video now. It's the only way this kind of close reading reaches more people who actually want it. And tell me in the comments, gates, mountains, foundations, does that sound like poetry to you? Or does it sound like a blueprint? Here is the detail almost no summary of Enoch includes. The garden associated with the tree of life is not described as lost, destroyed, or sealed off in some other realm, entirely inaccessible to the physical world. It is relocated, moved to the region of the 7 mountains, kept intact, maintained, and reserved for a future point when it will be needed again. The Ge'ez manuscript tradition, preserved at the Ethiopian Orthodox monastery in Aksum, uses language for this transfer that specialists translate as set aside rather than removed. Set aside implies a place that still exists, still occupies real space, and is simply not currently accessible, which is a very different claim than the paradise as metaphor reading most churches have taught for centuries. The Ge'ez term, rendered as foundation throughout these chapters, carries a legal and structural double meaning in Ethiopian scribal usage. It is the same word used elsewhere for something formally established, set down according to a plan, rather than something that simply occurred naturally over time. Dr. Ephraim Isaac's 1983 Oxford translation, working directly from the Ge'ez rather than relying on R. H. Charles's 1906 edition restores much of this specificity, dimensions, materials, fixed points, that Charles's translation had smoothed into generalized, reverent language. Isaac noted in his introduction that Charles appears to have interpreted rather than translated at several points in exactly these cosmological chapters. The difference between those two choices is the difference between an earth that was simply spoken into being and an earth that was engineered, measured, and set down according to a plan someone was willing to describe in detail. None of this is a claim that Enoch is a literal engineering manual for a flat, gated disk. But it's worth noting, carefully, that modern geodesy already acknowledges the Earth is not the smooth, perfect sphere popular imagination assumes. It's technically a geoid, an irregular, uneven shape, heavier and higher in some regions than others, its true form modeled rather than simply observed. Enoch's insistence on an Earth held up by fixed structural points, uneven by design rather than by accident, describes a planet with more deliberate irregularity built into it than either strict literalism or casual metaphor usually allows for. Whatever the writer believed he was recording, it wasn't a smooth ball floating in empty space. It was a structure with high points, low points, and edges that mattered. When the Council of Laodicea removed Enoch from Scripture in 364 CE, the stated objections centered on the Watcher's narrative and angelic hierarchy, not on the cosmological chapters specifically. This structural description of the Earth was never directly examined or refuted. It simply went out under the same broad ban. Jerome, compiling the Latin Vulgate around 400 CE, dismissed Enoch's cosmological material as unworthy of serious study, without addressing its geographic specifics. Augustine, in the City of God around 415 CE, argued that texts describing the physical world in this much detail invited speculation the Church could not control. Not that the details were wrong, but that specificity itself was the danger. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, operating outside Rome's authority, kept this material in its canon uninterrupted for over 16 centuries, and it was there, still intact, when James Bruce carried 3 Ge'ez manuscripts back to Europe in 1773. If you're the kind of person who wants to know what a 4th century council was actually protecting, rather than what it claimed to be protecting, hit subscribe and like this video before we finish. There's more of this cosmological material still ahead in this series. And tell me in the comments which detail unsettled you most, the gates, the relocated garden, or the foundation. In 2011, a team cataloging Qumran cosmological fragments, material connected to the astronomical book's gate descriptions, requested extended access to 2 fragments held at the Israel Museum for detailed comparative imaging alongside the Ge'ez tradition. The museum granted partial access. 2 specific fragments, among the most geographically detailed in the collection, were listed as unavailable pending conservation. The resulting comparative study, published several years later, noted that the withheld fragments likely contained material bearing directly on the structural language used elsewhere in the Earth and Gate passages. No timeline for their return to general research access has been published since. Maybe it's nothing more than the poetic imagination of a Second Temple writer reaching for the only structural language available to him: pillars, gates, mountains, foundations, because that was how ancient people described anything permanent and important. Or maybe a text written before the Roman Empire existed is describing something about the shape and structure of the world that its own translators have spent a century smoothing into safer, vaguer language, one word at a time. The gates are still described as maintained, the garden is still described as set aside, not destroyed, and the foundation Enoch was shown is still, in the oldest surviving language of the text, described as something built, not something that simply happened to be there. So here's the question the manuscript never answers for us. If the Earth really was described as engineered rather than accidental, what does that change about how you look at the ground under your feet tonight? Tell me what you believe in the comments. I read every one.